What makes someone dangerous? Is it cruelty? Is it seduction? Is it ambition without restraint? Or is it something far more unsettling? The ability to influence destiny without holding a sword. When most people read the Bible, they look for heroes, kings, warriors, prophets, but Scripture quietly records something far more disruptive. Women who did not simply support history, they redirected it. Some altered the spiritual climate of nations. Some brought mighty men to their knees. Some manipulated power structures. Some shattered them. Some preserved entire bloodlines. And they did not do it with armies. They did it with influence. Influence over belief. Influence over desire. Influence over timing. Influence over fear. The Bible does not sanitize these stories. It shows us women who were bold, strategic, calculated, courageous, and sometimes destructive. Because power is never neutral. Power always shapes something. The real question is not whether they were dangerous. The real question is, aligned with what? Tonight we will look at 5 women whose names still provoke debate. Not to judge them, not to sensationalize them, but to understand something deeper, how power works, how influence spreads, and what happens when alignment is lost or found. If you value biblical depth without superficial readings, and you enjoy exploring the psychological and spiritual layers behind Scripture, consider subscribing to the channel. And if this theme challenges you, let me know by liking and sharing. It tells me these stories still matter. Now, let's begin. Before we talk about seduction, before we talk about betrayal, before we talk about bloodshed, we must talk about ideology. Because Jezebel did not conquer Israel with an army. She entered through marriage. She arrived quietly, carrying culture, belief systems, and allegiance to Baal. And once inside the palace, she began reshaping the spiritual identity of a nation. She did not sit on the throne, but she controlled the throne. King Ahab wore the crown. Jezebel held the direction. She understood something most people underestimate. If you control belief, you control behavior. Altars were replaced. Prophets were hunted. Truth became dangerous. What made Jezebel terrifying was not cruelty alone. It was strategy. She didn't attack Israel from the outside. She transformed it from within. And this is how corruption usually works. It doesn't announce itself. It integrates. It doesn't force. It persuades. It doesn't destroy immediately. It slowly shifts alignment. Jezebel represents ideological invasion, when influence disconnects people from God while convincing them they are evolving. Her danger was systemic. She normalized spiritual compromise. She taught a nation to tolerate what once would have been unthinkable. And tolerance became agreement. Agreement became practice. Practice became identity. This is the anatomy of misalignment, not rebellion, adaptation. The people didn't wake up one morning rejecting God. They simply adjusted, little by little, until prophets were silenced and false worship felt normal. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Every human nervous system seeks familiarity, even when familiarity is toxic. Jezebel leveraged this. She understood psychology before psychology had a name. She created an environment where truth felt disruptive and corruption felt stable. That is real power, not loud power. Subtle power, the kind that reshapes values without raising alarms. Jezebel shows us that danger is not always emotional. Sometimes it is philosophical. She teaches us that spiritual warfare rarely begins with chaos. It begins with compromise. And once alignment is lost, everything downstream shifts. Relationships, leadership, culture, identity. This is why Scripture treats her story so seriously. Because Jezebel is not just a woman in history. She is a pattern, a warning, a reminder that influence without spiritual integrity eventually produces collapse. Power detached from truth always demands a price. And usually that price is paid by generations who never chose the corruption. They simply inherited it. Not all danger is loud. Not all destruction comes with shouting or violence. Some of the most devastating collapses begin in silence. Delilah did not confront Samson. She entered through closeness. Samson was physically unmatched, chosen, anointed, feared by enemies, but strength without discernment is fragile. Delilah never tried to overpower him. She studied him. She observed his patterns, his pride, his emotional blind spots. She asked simple questions again and again and again until resistance weakened. This is important. She did not force his secret out of him. She created emotional pressure until he surrendered it willingly. That is psychological warfare. Her power was not physical, it was relational. She weaponized access. She understood something most people overlook. Proximity creates vulnerability. The people closest to you do not need to fight you. They only need patience. Delilah represents misaligned intimacy, when connection is used not for covenant, but for extraction. She reminds us that betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from those who know where you are strong and where you are exposed. Samson lost his strength long before he lost his hair. He lost it the moment he confused affection with safety. Because spiritual power without emotional boundaries is unsustainable. Delilah did not steal his calling. She waited until he handed it to her. This is how influence operates at its most dangerous level, not through domination, through trust. She shows us something uncomfortable. Your greatest weakness is often not temptation. It is attachment. Samson wanted to be seen, wanted to be desired, wanted to feel understood, and Delilah offered just enough softness to bypass his discernment. She represents what happens when the nervous system seeks comfort instead of alignment. He knew who he was spiritually, but he did not protect who he was emotionally. So he traded long-term purpose for short-term closeness, and that exchange always ends the same way. Eyes blinded, freedom lost, identity shaken. Delilah teaches us that danger does not always arrive as threat. Sometimes it arrives as familiarity. Sometimes it feels warm. Sometimes it sounds gentle, and sometimes it waits quietly until you are tired enough to reveal what should have remained sacred. Her story is not primarily about seduction. It is about misplaced trust, about what happens when spiritual authority is not matched with emotional maturity, because power without inner alignment eventually collapses. And Delilah stands as a reminder. Not every battle is external. Some are fought inside your attachment patterns. Some power doesn't enter through belief. Some power enters through desire. Salome did not preach. She performed. A room full of authority. A king surrounded by guests, music, wine, applause, and one young woman dancing. Her movement shifted the atmosphere. Her presence redirected attention. Her body became influence. Herod watched. The court watched. And something ancient awakened in the room. Desire. In that moment, Herod made a vow. Not because it was wise, but because he was emotionally captured. He promised her anything, up to half his kingdom. This is what happens when desire bypasses discernment. Salome did not act alone. Behind her stood her mother, strategy layered beneath beauty, instruction hidden behind performance. She returned with a request that exposed everything: the head of John the Baptist, a prophet, a righteous man, silenced, because a king could not manage his impulses. Herod knew it was wrong. Scripture makes that clear. But he feared losing face more than he feared God. So he honored his oath, and conscience died in public. Salome represents influence through attraction, not intimacy like Delilah, not ideology like Jezebel, but spectacle. She shows how quickly moral clarity collapses when approval becomes more important than alignment. Her danger was not physical, it was atmospheric. She altered the emotional temperature of the room, and once emotion ruled, truth had no protection. This is critical, because Salome teaches us something deeply uncomfortable. You don't need authority to control outcomes. You only need access to attention. She did not hold office, she held focus. And focus shapes decisions. Her story reveals how easily power structures crumble when leaders are disconnected from their inner compass. Herod was not overpowered, he was overstimulated, he was not forced, he was seduced by his own unchecked desire. Salome becomes a mirror. She reflects what happens when environments reward performance but ignore character, when beauty carries more weight than wisdom, when image matters more than integrity. John lost his life, not because Salome hated him, but because no one in that room was anchored enough to protect truth. This is how spiritual erosion happens, not through persecution, through distraction. Salome reminds us that danger does not always arrive with aggression. Sometimes it arrives with applause. And when desire leads, conscience follows quietly behind. Not all danger comes from manipulation. Some danger comes from decision. Jael did not seek power. Power arrived at her doorstep. Sisera, commander of an oppressive army, fled the battlefield and entered her tent. He was exhausted, afraid, vulnerable. She welcomed him. She offered milk. She covered him with a blanket. Everything about the moment felt safe. But safety, in Scripture, does not always mean softness. Sometimes safety demands courage. Jael saw what others could not. She understood the weight of that moment. This was not just a man seeking refuge. This was the embodiment of years of violence, domination, and fear. And she realized something profound. If she let him leave alive, the cycle would continue, so she waited until he slept. And then she acted. No hesitation, no negotiation. One decisive movement ended a campaign of terror. Jael represents a kind of power we rarely talk about. Not seductive power, not ideological power, not emotional leverage. She embodies resolved action. Her story forces us into uncomfortable territory because Jael does not fit modern spiritual categories. She is not gentle. She is not passive. She is precise. She reminds us that sometimes alignment with God requires strength that looks uncomfortable to human eyes. Her danger was not strategic in the way Jezebel's was. It was not relational like Delilah's. It was not atmospheric like Salome's. It was final. She shows us that there are moments when delay becomes complicity, moments when neutrality becomes agreement with oppression. Jael did not debate morality while evil rested in her home. She chose responsibility. This is important because Jael reveals something rarely preached. There are seasons when survival requires confrontation, when peace demands decisive boundaries, when compassion must coexist with firmness. Her action did not come from rage, it came from clarity. She understood the cost of inaction. She understood that protection sometimes requires uncomfortable courage. Jael represents the side of faith that does not romanticize danger. She teaches us that spiritual alignment does not always look like patience. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground. Sometimes it looks like ending cycles. Sometimes it looks like saying, "This stops here." Her story challenges the idea that holiness is always quiet. Sometimes holiness carries weight. And Jael reminds us, not all deliverance comes through prayer alone. Sometimes it comes through bold, embodied action. Not all power is loud. Not all influence moves quickly. Some power waits. Esther did not arrive as a warrior. She entered history quietly. A young woman taken into a foreign palace, separated from her people, placed inside a system she did not design. She did not announce her identity. She observed. She learned the rhythms of power. She watched how decisions were made. And when a decree was signed to annihilate her entire people, she did not panic. She paused. This is critical. Esther understood something that many never learn. Timing is power. She could have spoken immediately. She could have exposed everything at once. But she waited. She fasted. She prayed. She aligned her inner world before confronting the external one. Esther represents strategic restraint. She teaches us that wisdom is not urgency. Wisdom is discernment. Her danger was not emotional like Delilah's, not ideological like Jezebel's, not seductive like Salome's, not forceful like Jael's. Her danger lived in patience. She approached the king knowing one wrong step could cost her life. And yet she moved forward anyway, not recklessly, intentionally. She created space through invitation. She hosted banquets. She let tension build. She allowed truth to mature in the atmosphere. Then, at the exact moment clarity met courage, she spoke. And an empire shifted. Haman fell. A genocide was reversed. A people were preserved. Esther shows us that alignment does not always require confrontation first. Sometimes it requires preparation. She teaches us that bravery is not impulsive. Bravery is embodied. She did not weaponize beauty. She did not manipulate desire. She did not apply pressure. She positioned herself. Her power was internal before it was external, and this is what makes Esther dangerous in the deepest sense. She was anchored. She did not allow fear to rush her. She did not allow comfort to silence her. She allowed purpose to guide her. Esther reminds us that you can be inside systems of power without becoming corrupted by them. You can carry influence without losing integrity. You can wait without becoming passive. Her story is not just about saving lives. It is about alignment under pressure, about learning when to speak, when to stay silent, when to move, and when to trust. Esther teaches us that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has done their inner work. Because when inner alignment meets external opportunity, history changes. When you place these stories side by side, a pattern emerges, not about gender, about power. Each woman expressed influence differently. One reshaped belief systems, one entered through emotional access, one controlled atmosphere through desire, one acted with decisive force, one waited with strategic restraint. Different methods, same impact. They remind us that power does not have a single language. Sometimes it speaks through ideology, sometimes through intimacy, sometimes through attraction, sometimes through confrontation, sometimes through silence. But power always moves through alignment. This is where most people misunderstand these stories. They reduce them to morality tales. Good woman, bad woman. But Scripture is doing something deeper. It is revealing how influence flows through the human nervous system, through fear, through attachment, through approval, through survival, through courage. These women were not dangerous because they were female. They were dangerous because they understood leverage. They knew where systems were vulnerable. They sensed emotional gaps. They recognized moments of instability, and they acted. Some used their power to corrupt, some used it to deliver, but all of them exposed something essential. Unaligned power always destroys. Aligned power transforms. This is the dividing line, not strength versus weakness, alignment versus disconnection. Jezebel shows us what happens when belief is redirected away from God. Delilah shows us what happens when intimacy is divorced from discernment. Salome shows us what happens when desire overrides conscience. Jael shows us what happens when survival demands decisive boundaries. Esther shows us what happens when courage is guided by wisdom. These stories are not ancient drama. They are mirrors. They reflect the same dynamics playing out today. In leadership, in relationships, in churches, in governments, inside families. Power still enters through influence. It still hides inside familiarity. It still rides on emotion. It still waits for moments of weakness. And it still responds to alignment. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Every human carries power, not political power, relational power, emotional power, spiritual authority. The question is not whether you have influence. The question is how consciously you use it. Because unhealed trauma uses power defensively. Insecurity uses power manipulatively. Fear uses power reactively. But alignment uses power responsibly. This is why inner work matters. This is why spiritual maturity matters. These women did not just change events. They revealed what happens when the inner world drives the outer world. Your nervous system leads your decisions. Your attachments shape your boundaries. Your beliefs guide your courage. And your alignment determines your impact. Power is never neutral. It either heals or harms. It either preserves or corrupts. It either liberates or controls. And every day, in quiet ways, each of us chooses which direction our influence flows. These stories don't exist to entertain you. They exist to confront you. Because the Bible is not just showing us what these women did. It is revealing how power moves through the human heart. And now the question becomes personal. Not about them, about you. Where does your influence flow? Do you shape environments? Or do environments shape you? Do you speak from alignment or from reaction? Do you move from clarity or from unresolved emotion? Every one of these women shows us something essential. Power always passes through the nervous system before it becomes action. Jezebel acted from control. Delilah from attachment. Salome from stimulation. Jael from survival. Esther from alignment. Different inner states, different outcomes. This is where most spiritual conversations stop too early. They talk about behavior, but behavior is downstream. Upstream is regulation. Upstream is belief. Upstream is safety. If your body lives in fear, your decisions will carry fear. If your heart is hungry for validation, your influence will seek approval. If your spirit is disconnected, your power will drift. But when your inner world is aligned, your presence becomes grounded. Your voice becomes steady. Your boundaries become clear. You no longer need to manipulate. You no longer need to rush. You no longer need to perform. You move differently. You listen differently. You respond instead of react. This is what Esther embodied. She didn't allow panic to lead. She didn't allow comfort to silence her. She allowed alignment to guide her. And this is the invitation of these stories, not to become dangerous in the worldly sense, but to become conscious, to notice how your emotions influence your choices, to see where your attachments override your discernment, to recognize when you are acting from protection instead of purpose. Because power without awareness becomes destructive, but power anchored in alignment becomes healing. You don't need a throne to shape outcomes. You shape outcomes in conversations, in parenting, in leadership, in silence, in the way you carry tension, in the way you hold space, in the way you tell the truth. This is spiritual maturity, not perfection. Presence, not domination. Discernment, not control. Connection. These women remind us that influence does not begin in the world. It begins inside you. And every day, in subtle ways, you are choosing what kind of power you embody. If these stories stirred something inside you, don't rush past it. Let yourself feel what surfaced, because Scripture doesn't just inform, it reveals. And revelation always invites response, not performance. Presence. Take a slow breath. Notice your body. Notice your thoughts. Notice where tension lives. These women remind us that power is not something reserved for kings or queens. It lives in your nervous system, in your choices, in your boundaries, in the way you love, in the way you lead, in the way you heal. You don't need to be louder. You don't need to prove strength. You don't need to control outcomes. You need alignment, mind, body, spirit. That is where real authority begins. If this journey helped you see Scripture through a deeper lens, stay connected with this space. We explore faith not as religion, but as embodied wisdom. And if you feel called, share this with someone who may need it. Sometimes the most powerful ministry is simply passing light forward. Remember, you are not here to survive. You are here to become whole. And when wholeness leads, your influence changes everything.